Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Destiny Awaits podcast. I'm so excited because today you are going to notice some changes to our studio. You'll notice behind me, I have a little work thing going on. This is when I'm guest on podcasts and I'm working on my computer, but you're going to see the little part that's our studio. If you follow me on social media, you will have seen that my brother, Eddie Villar, came here. He is a sound engineer. His passion is drumming, but he's really good with sound, understands all these things and lighting. The man definitely hears and sees things that I do not. So he came here, traveled here to help me. We got sound panels and lighting in here and all this awesome stuff that's just going to improve the podcast. So I'm so excited that this week you'll get to see that. If you are just an audio listener, no worries, because you will see an improvement or hear an improvement in the sound. Now, disclaimer on that, because at some point in the middle of the recording, you're going to start hearing crackling, maybe, unless we change that. But for some reason, the sound started to crackle. It was fine, started off fine. Then the crackling came in and then it resolved itself. And I'm not sure how or why. We did stop the podcast at one point to break and use the restroom. So I thought maybe we touched something that did it, but no, that's not what happened. So I'm just being authentic and honest with you guys, like giving you behind the scenes. I'm not sure what happened. I would just remove that portion. I haven't yet started editing the podcast and I have to head off to the girls' school to volunteer, but I wanted to do this intro so that it was already done before I did that. I'm not sure how I'm going to remove or fix the crackle. However, with the video that I got, I did get sound off the video. It's just not as clean and crisp as this. So I'm not sure if I'll replace it with that audio. Whatever, I will do whatever it takes to give you some sort of decent audio during that portion, because there is some meaty stuff in that part of the conversation and I don't want to just delete it, because I really think you guys will get something from it and enjoy it. So I'm going to keep it in. Got to reach out to my brother. So Eddie, if you're listening to this, I need your help. By this point, I will have received your help. But I'm going to reach out, see what we can do about that. And then if all else fails, I have the backup audio from the camera that we were gathering. So you may hear a shift in the sound, and that's simply because we want you to be able to have it without the crackling sound, because crackling is worse than bad sound, if that makes sense. So I feel like you listening to it on video audio is better than crackling. So I don't know. Got to figure that out. Make sure it doesn't happen in the future. So improving each week. The video is significantly higher quality moving forward, but at the tail end, my camera started to heat and it turned off. But thankfully, I was getting backup video on that too. So I had backup audio, backup video, thank goodness. So you're going to see a little bit of a shift in the video if you're watching towards the end. But again, it's we're ending the podcast. It would be kind of weird if I just left it out. It would kind of feel like we left you on a cliff and didn't finish up. So we'll get the audio going and the video going. So hopefully you guys enjoy it. I think the conversation is great. I had a lot of doubts going into it, but Mike helped clarify some things. And I had also clarified some things before, but I think it'll bring a lot of clarity to you. This is the passage on the Sermon of the Mount where Jesus said he came to fulfill the law and not abolish it. And I just had lots of questions, and I feel like a lot of people do. So hopefully you guys enjoy this conversation. But each week we will get better. I promise you, we are working on it. We're getting better at this. We are self-produced. So it's, tweaking things as we go. Your support is so wonderful. Wherever you are watching this, make sure to subscribe, to follow, to like, and to share. If you know someone who loves studying the Bible and or wants to start studying the Bible, this is just a great thing to jump on. And I just think the Sermon on the Mount is absolutely amazing, life-changing. I'm reading it every day, as you're going to hear in this episode. So yeah, so I'll stop rambling. Hopefully you guys enjoy it. Let me know what you guys think. Don't forget to comment, like on Spotify, YouTube, wherever you're watching this. A lot of places now allow you to actually comment and interact. I would love to hear from you and get to know you a little bit better, get your questions, get your feedback, and just get better and better each week. So without further ado, let's dive in. Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the Destiny Awaits podcast. I am Andrew John.
And I'm Michael.
And we are continuing on the journey through the Sermon on the Mount. And we're up to a passage that I have a very hard time with. Mm-hmm. I really do not like talking about things that I cannot articulate, explain, or fully understand, but here we are.
I'm very used to talking about things I don't understand.
I have to feel very confident. I will say, though, over the last 2 weeks, I have been diving in, looking into things, and trying my best to have some sense of understanding. And I feel like I have gotten there. I don't think that I am well versed enough to explain it. So this is all you.
No, I disagree. The amount of times that you've rushed into the room with your new light bulb moments of things you've never noticed before, despite our many conversations about it, tells me that you actually do have a pretty good grasp of it at this point. Because you were very accurate on a lot of the stuff you were bringing up to me. So,
well, yes, but I still have questions, and I had questions that I probably will ask you, just because if I had those questions, I'm pretty sure folks listening have the same questions. So why don't we start off with reading the passage? You read it from your conventional translation, which is?
NET.
Okay, so
which is not really conventional, actually. Most people do not use NET.
Yes, I will say NET is not conventional. I do want to plug the fact that on the YouTube channel, I do have a reading of the entire Sermon on the Mount from the NET translation, and there will be one coming from the NLT, and I'll get into that translation in a little bit. So why don't you start off by reading?
Which verse would you like me to start with?
So we are doing, great point for our listeners, Matthew 5:17 through 20.
Okay. So Matthew 5:17 through 20. Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of the letter will pass from the law, until everything that takes place. So anyone who breaks one of these least of these commandments and teaches others to do so will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever obeys them and teaches others to do so will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness goes beyond that of the experts in the law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
Okay. So many questions, so many things that I want to say, but let me read it from the Message. So, for those who maybe this is your first time, you may have just stumbled across this because the algorithm pushed it out to you because you're looking through the law and grace and things like that. We started this series because I read the Sermon on the Mount in the Message translation, and it was so convicting. So we've basically been using it to compare what it's saying. The Message translation is not a word for word, it's a paraphrase, but it really translates the concepts. That's what they try to do. So this is what the Message says. Don't suppose for a minute that I have come to demolish the scriptures, either God's law or the prophets. I'm not here to demolish, but to complete. I'm going to put it all together in a vast panorama. God's law is more real and lasting than the stars in the sky and the ground at your feet. Long after stars burn out and earth wears out, God's law will be alive and working. Trivialize even the smallest item in God's law, and you will only have trivialized yourself. But take it seriously, show the way for others, and you will find honor in the kingdom. Unless you do far better than the Pharisees in the matters of right living, you won't know the first thing about entering the kingdom.
Yeah, there's some, actually not too bad, actually. Few things I would take issue with, but yeah, not too bad.
Well, this whole part that says, I'm going to put it all together, pull it all together in a vast panorama. What the heck does that even mean? Like, to me, it's kind of like if I'm reading a paraphrased version, I'm hoping that you're saying it in a way that's going to make sense to me. That made it like more obscure.
Yeah, they took an already confusing passage and then just figured out a way to make it more vague.
I know.
It's like, this is vague. Let's put it in a vague way in today's times.
Let's be poetic, because poetry is just so clear.
How would
and
they
concise.
have said this very vague today?
I know.
And that's not what we're trying to do.
Well, it's funny because it's very poetic, right? But poetry is not really a direct thing. It's very abstract.
And in their defense, I do agree with the idea of pointing out that there's a lot of parabolic language here.
Yes.
Poetic language, literary language, and this language is using idioms that they understood back then, and so they're recognizing that.
Right.
I don't necessarily agree with the whole panorama thing.
Yeah.
I don't get that at all.
It sounds nice, though.
But I think what they're trying to do is saying, oh yeah, he used an idiom here. Let's use an idiom from our time. I mean, okay, fine, whatever.
Yes,
it's just kind of an idiotic thing to do, but.
Okay, so what I will say is, I have been reading the Sermon on the Mount every single day, and I try to do different translations.
But have you been reading it in the King James Version?
I have not yet.
Okay, well, still going to hell.
However, I do plan to read it in the King James.
Okay.
Because there's value in every translation, and the more I get to know the Sermon on the Mount, the easier it is for me to pick up on things, even when I'm reading other books in the Bible.
Okay.
Like, oh, this was in the Sermon on the Mount. So, for example, Luke, I'm reading the Gospel of Luke. It has a lot of stuff from the Sermon on the Mount. So I'm able to look and say, how did Luke say this? And how did he bring it up? And in what context? And because each author is really pointing something out that matters to them. Mm-hmm. So Matthew has chosen to portray these teachings here. So I was reading it in the NLT, and it's funny because the NLT is actually one of my favorite translations. I know a lot of academics and scholars would probably be like, ew, but it just is. The readability is great. I just have a lot of understanding. Even when I read things like Proverbs, it's just amazing. When I read this part in the NLT, something that I've been confused, well, two things that kind of were a little confusing to me popped out at me. And I was like, oh, I get it. Yes, I do have it. So let me read it to see, before we start talking, to see if the listeners, maybe it clarifies something for them like it did for me. Okay, so NLT. Don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth. Until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear. until its purpose is achieved. So if you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you will be called the least in the kingdom of God. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven.
Okay.
I think that word...
What popped out to you?
So where it says, no, I have come to accomplish their purpose.
Okay.
Because usually we hear he's come to fulfill it, right? What the heck? Okay, so let's start this conversation so maybe you can explain it. What the heck does that mean? Like, he came to fulfill it. So he came to do it. He came to be it. Because this is the big question. Like, if I were to think about what's the big question that I have about this passage?
Right.
Well, not necessarily the conflict with the teachings we hear today. So we know there's a new covenant with Jesus, which that's one thing I want you to talk about. So there's a new covenant. We know we're not under the old covenant. That's established in numerous places in the scriptures. I know that.
Are you sure?
Yes, I know that. We are.
Not everyone knows that.
We are under what some would say grace, right? Like that's how people say we're under grace, we're not under the law, things like that. So I know that. But then I read this passage and I'm like, that's in conflict to everything else because...
Why do you think it's in conflict?
Because Jesus
The opening line?
No, because
do not
actually...
think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets?
But to fulfill it. No, that's not the part. The part that I feel like contradicts is I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until it's... See, this is the thing. Until its purpose is achieved. So if you ignore the least, like he's basically saying, you still have to follow these laws.
Yeah. So in NET it says will pass, not one letter or stroke of letter will pass from the law.
Yes, which
so
makes sense.
This is really important because it says it will pass from the law until everything takes place.
Yeah, so...
A little bit different wording there.
So accomplish its purpose, I think, is what helped make the until it takes place make sense to me.
Until everything takes place. Yeah, because there's a lot about to take place.
Yes. So that's something that I do know. So like that helped me click. Okay, so first question that I have for you is so we have the covenants, right? We talked a little bit about covenants with Salt Covenant. Salt Covenant, we had Abraham and David. So their covenants still come through today.
Yeah, they're called grant covenants is another term.
Okay. So why is it, my first question is, the law of Moses was a covenant, like we call it the old covenant.
Yes.
So one thing I want to clarify to anyone listening is...
Not a grant covenant, by the way.
Yeah, so I'm going to have you explain it, but I just want to clarify because some people may be new to the Bible. There is the Old Testament and there is the New Testament. When we use the word covenant, we're not using it interchangeably with testament. So, because some people do that. Oh, the Old Covenant, the New Covenant. The Old Testament is the books in the Bible before the Gospels.
Right.
And the New Testament is everything after Matthew. Okay.
Right.
When we're talking about the Old Covenant, the New Covenant, we are talking about agreements, would you say? Like their agreements, think of contracts, things like that. So what kind of covenant did God make with Moses that caused it to not be permanent and be able to come to an end? Like what separates it from salt?
Well, first of all, it wasn't what God wanted. If you go back and you read in Leviticus, or not Leviticus, Deuteronomy actually, God wanted his people to come up on the mountain. He wanted them to be kings and priests, okay? And it looked like they were going to accept it at first, but then they turned and they said, no, you're scary. We don't want relationship with you, which is completely understandable. They came out of Egypt. They have a slave mindset. They have an abused mindset. You know, they've been beaten for generations now, and anybody in power is very dangerous. Being close to a pharaoh, being close to a king was a very dangerous position to be in. Highly likely you get killed. And so they didn't want to be that close to God, okay? And they were afraid, and they said, "Tell you what, we want representatives. You give them the rules. They tell us what to do, we'll follow them."
Mm-hmm.
And because God had invited them up onto Mount Sinai to be kings and priests and walk in relationship with them, and they said, "No, we want rules." And so God gave them a covenant that was actually pretty well known during that time, okay? And it's called a kinship covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And the closest thing that was in the earth that was similar to that is when two kings, basically, they let's say they make an agreement, okay, and in the agreement, you have a greater king and a lesser king, obviously, or sometimes you have two equal kings, and the agreement is if you go to war, or if you find yourself being attacked, right? Then we will come and fight with you. Okay, it's a kinship covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And if we'll agree to fight for one another, we'll agree to a list of rules that we both agree to.
Mm-hmm.
We'll write those rules down on tablets of stone. They would back then. People don't realize that happened throughout all over during that time. And they would write the rules down, and then the idea was you would take that tablet with those rules, agreements that they had. It could be a lot of different things. It could be taxes they would pay. It could be defending one another. But in particular was two kings, okay? And they would make an agreement with one another to do different things. It could be a list of rules that they would write down on tablets of stone. It could be back then they would have had agreements where if one went to war, the other one would go to war and fight with them. And they would make this agreement. They would agree not to attack each other. They would agree to defend each other.
They're allies.
They were allies, essentially, yeah. And but also they would have rules written down, everything that they were going to agree to, and they would swear by it, and they would basically take their tablet that they had, and usually these kings served different gods, okay?
Right.
There were many different gods. They rarely served the same god, so what ended up happening was they would write it down on a tablet stone. One king would take it to their god's temple and place it in their temple, and then the other king would take that same copy, it was two copies, and he would take it to his temple and place it in the temple of his god. And the idea was, so for example, if you and I were making a kinship covenant, which by the way, we have very similar one, it's called a marriage.
Right.
We have a very similar version of that in America, in the world, actually. Marriage, very common.
Yes.
But
I think the whole world does marriage, I think, yeah.
Very similar to a kinship covenant, okay? There's a list of rules. There's a list of things that we have agreed to.
There's agreements, yeah.
Yep, and we are expected to abide by it. And the idea was, assume we serve two different gods, like you were Muslim and I'm Christian, or vice versa. The other, actually, the latter is more likely. But anyway, no, I'm just kidding.
Well, it depends who's looking at it, because some people think it is the same God.
But anyways, so they. You would take the agreement, the marriage license, the covenant, or the Ten Commandments in this case, and you would place it in the temple of your God. I would place a copy in the temple of my God. The idea is that your God, if you violated it, because I have no recourse if you violate it, otherwise you and I are at war, right? But if you violate, the idea is if you're going to go place it before your God will punish you. And they had a very different relationship with their gods.
Well,
they actually believed their gods would come down and punish them.
Right. So think about even the reverence that they had for one another's gods, to trust that your God will take care of you if you break this promise.
Oh, yeah.
That's pretty intense. It just goes to show how faith and belief was so ingrained in their cultures,
Yeah,
regardless of whether you believe the same or not.
It didn't matter.
Right.
What God do you believe in? Place it in the temple of your God.
Mhm.
Your God will punish you.
Right.
And so, we see a very similar covenant was set up with God and Moses and the people of Israel, because they had the Ten Commandments.
Mhm.
It was 2 copies. They wrote on both sides. And so there was 2 tablets of stone, 5 on one. Well, we assume 5 on the front, 5 on the back, something like that.
Well, yeah,
It could
which
have been
is
3 and 7,
when we
but
see the Ten Commandments depicted, we always see 2 tablets, and our assumption is what? There's 5 on one tablet and 5 on the other tablet.
they would not have been that wasteful.
But really, it was 2 copies.
2 copies, yep.
Yeah.
It would have been written, the law would have been written on both the front and back, or the 10 Commandments.
Right.
And they took both copies because they served the same God, right? And they took both copies and placed it in the temple.
Didn't they put it in like the Ark of the Covenant or something like inside the Ark?
Yes, and they placed the Ark
inside the temple. So in the Holy of Holies.
In the Holy of Holies, yeah. And so we have this agreement, and that put God in a very difficult spot because there's no God above him.
Mm-hmm.
But he put his word over him.
What you just said, can I just take a moment? Because what you just said is very controversial to some. You literally just said God was put in a very hard spot. But is it? Like, isn't God all powerful? How can he be put in a difficult spot?
Well, I'm going to explain what I mean by that. He was put into a very difficult spot because he agreed to this covenant that he didn't want to give them, but they demanded it. So he said, okay. But it also put him into a bad spot because here's a loving God who wants to take care of his people and make them all kings and priests. They're demanding rules. Okay. Well, what was part of the covenant? The part of the covenant is if you violate, your God will do what?
Punish you.
So now he becomes both the protector
and the punisher.
Yeah. That's the difficult spot.
Right.
So,
well, and what's crazy, what some people don't realize is, okay, so man wanted that. He wanted them to be priests and kings, and they rejected it. They didn't want it. They wanted someone else to go for whatever reason. They were afraid. They wanted to be like the other people groups. But why would God do that? I mean, God's God. He could just make them do it. But I think what a lot of people miss is the purpose of creation and the purpose of humanity. Because when you realize that God created humanity to have relationship with them, then you realize, oh, okay, so God gave us free will. It's a law. There is free will that everyone has. Okay, so God couldn't force everyone to do what he wanted, but when he goes back to his purpose and says, what I really want, the core of what I want is a relationship with these people, then that's going to be his aim. What do I need to do to build a relationship with these people? And this was the answer to that.
Yeah. Now, that was the first part of the law. Right. Then, anytime someone dies, a covenant can be renegotiated if it's not a salt covenant, okay? If it's not a grant covenant, okay? We've Noah and Abraham and David, they had grant covenants. They could pretty much do whatever they wanted. God was going to bless them. Grant covenant, real quickly, is a greater king and a lesser king. And the greater king chooses to bless the lesser king or a lowly person, someone that's lower than him. And he agrees to just bless them carte blanche.
Okay.
Okay, do whatever you want. Okay,
that's like
you're
Abraham
blessed.
think, I will make you more numerous than the stars. I will bless you. You will be blessed.
Yeah.
And
Keep in mind, Abraham loved God, worshiped God, followed God without that blessing.
Right.
And so God knew his heart. He knew what type of person he was. Then God decided to bless him and then bless him even more. There were several promises he gave him, like multiplying his people and all that. So we have grant covenant, kinship covenant, 2 equal kings making an agreement together. They won't punish each other.
It's kind of crazy that God saw Israel in an equal fashion to him.
Yeah, because he could have given them a very different situation. There were other covenants out there that were much more stringent,
Yeah.
that had much deeper ramifications of
Yeah.
failure. For example, if you stole under some other covenants that were very similar to the kinship covenant, they would chop your hand off. But under the law, even after the kinship covenant changed, they would if you stole, you had to pay it back 4 times.
Okay.
Which is a lot better than losing your hand. Okay, it also points to restoration, because now you're having, as a thief, you're having to go out, work 4 times harder to go pay everything back.
Yeah.
Plus survive yourself, right? So that was a good thing. So then there was a change that happened, because the 10 Commandments, it didn't stop there.
Right.
Remember, so Moses eventually died, and Joshua took over.
Right.
And God said, I'm going to renegotiate this covenant, because you guys failed to keep it. And every time they failed to keep it and God had to step in and punish them, quick side note, Moses stepped in and talked God out of killing all of the children of Israel a couple of times.
Yes. So that's a good, totally different topic, but just to throw it out there for those of you who love to dig and like to think, God does change his mind, because there were times where Moses was able to appeal with God and get God to change his mind about things he was going to do.
Yes. And so, and he could, because he was the covenant partner.
Right.
Moses was God's covenant partner,
Right.
which is another key aspect to this that
Yeah.
we'll get into. Moses was God's covenant partner. The people of Israel were not God's covenant partner.
Right.
Moses was
He
God's
was like
covenant
their
partner.
representative, yeah.
Yeah, no, he was more than representative. He was the covenant partner with God. Moses was.
Okay.
That's a whole nother level. Okay, the covenant was not with the people, it was with Moses. And so God could have destroyed all the children of Israel, and he could have restarted over with Moses, but he didn't. Moses talked him out of it a couple of times. But when they had failed so many times, they had kept it very normal back then. If 2 kings made a covenant like that, a kinship covenant, and one king did not keep up his end of the bargain, okay, very well, not only would there be punishment, but also when that king died, the new king that came up or rose up in that region, a renegotiation would happen.
Okay.
Because that's now the end of that covenant to a certain degree.
Okay.
And so a renegotiation happened when Joshua came along, and it turned from a kinship covenant to what they would call like a suzerain covenant or vassal covenant.
Okay. I've heard of vassal covenant.
So vassal covenant is tremendously worse than a kinship covenant, because now what you have is one king is establishing themselves as being the greater king.
Okay.
And the other king is definitely very weak.
Right.
And also failed to keep the agreement. So now vassal covenant would be used where, let's say, a king comes along in that region or during that time, okay, and came upon a village, and he's got tons of soldiers, tons of power behind him, and he comes along a village, and there's a little village king there, maybe with just a few soldiers, maybe some farmers to defend himself, and he goes, okay, you know what, instead of killing all of you guys because I can totally dominate you, I'm going to let you live. But in return, you owe me everything.
You're under my reign. It's kind of what happened with Rome. That's what Rome did, right?
Yeah, essentially. Yeah.
They conquered all the lands. Yeah. They were over all of them. They got to be their own people. Like the Jewish people got to live as Jewish people, but under Rome.
They were the only ones, though. The rest of them had to completely change. So this would be worse than what the Jews had. This is where, like, when they went into the Gauls and some of these other areas, and they actually not only destroyed all the people, but they destroyed their culture, their way of life.
Okay.
Everything changed.
So you don't exist anymore.
You
are
no
now
rights.
Literally one of us.
Yeah, you have no rights.
Okay.
You're not even one of us. You're a slave. You owe your life to us.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is what happened when Moses died. Joshua came in.
A version of
this kind of covenant.
Yeah, that type of covenant happened.
Okay.
And so greater king, lesser king, and now the rules became much more difficult.
So are those like all the rules in Deuteronomy and Leviticus or whatever it is? So those all came about with Joshua.
Most of them, yes. There was a few rules that were during the Moses' time beyond the 10 Commandments, but a majority of them came about during the time of Joshua. Okay. Yeah. And so we see that shift in the covenant from kinship to vassal, and it's bad. And today we just call it the law. Today we just call it the old covenant.
Yeah.
But then we go, because people have such a small understanding of the Bible, they loop David into it, they loop Abraham into it. And keep in mind, David's after Joshua, right? So how does that happen, right?
Yes.
So David just basically, he was an extreme renegade. Like, he just said, hey, I can have a relationship with God.
Directly, yes.
And I can get around this because I can do this through relationship because of what God ultimately wants anyways.
Like, think about
he had like a revelation that no one else had.
Think about how savage David was when you read about David's life and you realize he went into the temple and ate the bread inside the temple.
Yeah. Normally,
if it was anybody else, you would have been dead.
Yeah.
Struck down. And there's David eating the bread inside the temple.
Not just eating the bread inside the temple. Him being in the temple, he wasn't a high priest, one. Okay.
Yes, he didn't even belong in there.
And there's another reason why he didn't belong in there. Did you know that he was a bastard child?
Yes, I did know
so
that.
Being a bastard child, he had no business even were close to it.
Right.
Right? He was way out of line.
Right.
So we have this David who saw God's heart, wanted relationship with God, and so David kind of got a grant type covenant
right
during the time of the law.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That's crazy, right? But he did get that, and we see that with David. So what my point is we have to be very careful not to lump, like you said, the entire Old Testament and really part of the New Testament is all still under the law.
Yeah, so that's another good distinction, because in the New Testament, we have to realize that while Jesus was alive, they were still under the old covenant.
Yeah, no new covenant.
So some of the old covenant was still in existence during the New Testament, like when we read the New Testament.
Yeah, technically, the old covenant existed throughout the entire writing of the Bible, because it wasn't done away with until 70 AD.
So nothing was written after 70 AD?
Nothing.
Okay.
Not that it got into the canon.
Yeah.
Not that it got into the canon.
Okay.
So there was a lot of writings after that. We just don't call them scripture.
Okay.
They didn't call them scripture. I'm a little more liberal on that.
So this is a thing.
So let's get back to 17.
Jesus does say, he makes it like, and I just want to point this out because he said, I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets.
Yeah.
And this is something that you see a lot in the New Testament, where they refer to the law and the prophets, meaning the writings of the prophets.
Yeah.
Meaning the writings of the prophets were just as important as the law. But there were some who followed them, some Jewish sects that followed them, and some that didn't.
Yeah.
So I just wanted to point that out, because that's why they're both here. They're not the same thing.
No, they're not.
They're two different things, but held by some groups to the same degree. And you can see here, Jesus is holding them all to the same degree.
Yeah, to a certain degree, he is, at least for this point.
Right.
And do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets, but I've come to abolish these things. I've not come to abolish these things, but to fulfill them. Sorry, wow, word salad. Okay, so I want to grab Hebrews 8:13.
He just said
what?
Word salad.
Oh, I Kamala'd that up for sure. But Hebrews 8, chapter 8, verse 13.
Who would have thought that would become an idiom? And oh my goodness, I can't even handle it.
I Kamala'd that for sure.
Hebrews what?
Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13.
Oh, 8. Okay.
Now, every time I say something stupid, I can just say, wow, I really Kamala'd that. Or, well, that was crazy word salad, wasn't it? And then I'm just move on, right? I can just keep...
Everyone knows what you're talking about.
Everyone knows what I'm talking about, and I don't have to feel bad about it anymore.
1,000 years from now will be different, though.
Yeah, so chapter 8, verse 13, it says, when he speaks of a new covenant, he makes the first obsolete. Now, what is growing obsolete and aging is about to disappear. Well, what is he talking about? Well, so he's talking about how he quoted stuff from Jeremiah. All the way back in Jeremiah 31 through 34, he's quoting it in the previous verses in chapter 8, verse
yeah.
8, 9, 10,
All the way
11.
to 12.
Yeah. So in 8:7, he's not quoting. He says, "For if that first covenant had been faultless, no one would have looked for a second one. But it's showing its fault." So God says to them, and then he quotes Jeremiah. So even all the way back in Jeremiah, he's talking about this covenant not being what God wants, and it has its faults.
Yep. Which is crazy because to a lot of people, and again, this is another very controversial thing and may feel very difficult to hear, because what do you mean there was fault in the law? God created the law. God is perfect. How did he mess up?
It's a very dumb way to look at it.
But it's what we've been taught. Like, I understand that when you say it out, because man is the one who wanted it, right? But God is the creator of it in essence.
If I was perfect, okay, let's flip this so it make more sense. Let's say you're perfect. I just want everyone to relate.
Okay? Yeah, okay.
So let's say you're perfect.
That is a better example. Okay. All right.
I have a lot of faults.
Yes. Okay.
For you and I to be married, any agreement that we have is going to have faults. But how could a perfect Andrea have a marriage with someone with lots of faults?
It's a mystery.
So that doesn't make sense. That's literally what you're saying.
Right.
A perfect God has absolutely nothing to do with the faults of Israel.
Okay. I see.
God had to have an agreement with a flawed people that were refusing to walk in a normal marriage. Yes. It'd be like us flipping. This is a terrible thing to say, but it'd be like us flipping from a normal marriage to like an open marriage. Right. Something you don't want or I don't want. Hopefully.
You said that with like, you don't want and I don't want.
Hopefully we don't want that. But my point is that's a problem, and that's a marriage in a relationship we don't want. Right. So if we don't want that relationship, but one of us was determined to be in the relationship with the other one who wanted it, that'd be a problem. Right. And that's literally what's going on here to a certain degree. Or how about this? I'll make this a little more relatable in case you need to cut this out for the religious people. What if you and I entered a relationship, okay, and the relationship was very controlling and manipulative and difficult?
On both sides, or
no, just on one side. You're perfect. I'm the difficult one. I'm the controlling one. I'm the manipulative one. But you, being perfect, were determined to have a relationship with me. Right. Wouldn't that? That's going to affect your ability to operate. It's going to make you not really perfect.
Yes, I can actually
and
relate.
The marriage is going to have a tremendous amount of problems.
I can actually relate to that a lot. Not with you, but I can relate to
I'm
the
sure
point
you
where
can.
that covenant had to, that covenant had to be broken.
What does that say about our marriage? Next week, working on Michael and Andrea's marriage.
No, not with you, but that's like the covenant had to be broken because it was flawed. Like there was no way to fix it. It was
no matter how perfect one side is.
Yes.
It's going to be a flawed agreement.
Yes. Okay.
So God can enter into a flawed agreement and still be perfect.
And I think when we look at Jesus, when you look at the New Testament, so talking about Matthew on, you look at the New Testament over and over again, you do see Jesus at times saying things that insinuate like, I have come to reveal the law, because almost like the way I take it is, you've been interpreting this wrong the whole time. Like, why are you laughing?
Nothing. There's things that pop in my brain that I can't say out loud.
Okay, let's not then. But it's almost like you've been interpreting this wrong, so I'm here to reveal it to you. I'm here to show you the heart behind it. And then, so let me see if I have another question.
So can we stay on 17 for a second?
Yeah.
So I think that was the beginning of where you struggled, right? So do not think that I've come to abolish the law or the prophets, but I've come to abolish these things but to fulfill them, but yet we're not under the law. That's a question a lot of people
Right.
ask.
But the question is like, okay, fine. The law isn't in existence, but we still follow the 10 Commandments. Like,
Do we?
yeah, like think about it. We're not going to go around killing. Coveting is still wrong. We need to worship God. So, in essence, the essence of it, we do still follow the 10 Commandments.
The question is, why do we follow the 10 Commandments? Is it because of the 10 Commandments?
No, because there's a moral foundation to the whole thing.
Exactly. See, the whole idea was not to follow the 10 Commandments. It was for these things to be written on our hearts.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Even in Isaiah, it talks about how it's going to be written on our hearts. Right? It is not enough to have a rule and to agree to obey it. You and I can have rules, okay, in our relationship. We can have, okay, we agree to be loyal to each other, all that kind of stuff, right? That's a rule that has to be in our heart, right? It's something we have to want to do.
Right.
We can't just obey it because it's a rule.
Right.
It has to be in our heart. It has to be something that we want to do. Are you following me?
Yes. I mean, when you look at...
So if you just obey the law, and you obey the rule, great, you obeyed the rule. But if it's not in your heart to do it, that's the new covenant. We don't kill, we don't steal, we don't destroy, because we have a new law, which is to love one another.
Right.
The way God loved us.
Well, and so much so that if you think about, it's later on in Matthew, I think Matthew 22, if I'm not mistaken, but also in Luke, where a religious leader goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, what's the greatest commandment?
Yeah.
Because there were tons of commandments, right? And laws. So it was like, well, what's the greatest one? And Jesus said, love the Lord your God above all else. And then he added, but the second...
I'm listening, I'm just pulling something up because I know we're going to talk about it.
The second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. So during that time, there was a lot of debate about scripture, about the law, what should be observed, what shouldn't be observed. Because what people don't realize is, now we look and we say, well, all these things happened 2,000 years ago. It's historically and culturally different from what we have today. So we need to understand the history and the culture of the time. Well, during Jesus's time, that debate was also happening. Because by the time Jesus came around, these laws were put in place 1,000 years ago. And culture was very different during Jesus's time. So the argument and the things that they would discuss in the synagogues and stuff would be, how do we apply these laws that are outdated even for them? Like, even for people at Jesus's time, some of the laws were outdated because they were no longer culturally relevant. They weren't applicable.
Right.
So here you have people look, when Jesus says this is the greatest one, they've all been debating this stuff. Okay, out of all these things, what does it matter? And what they would discuss a lot of times is, what's the principles of the law?
Yeah.
There were some sects that they were very, well, this is the principle of the law. You don't have to follow 613. You just have to make sure this is the life you're living. And then
you're saying there were Jewish sects at that time that had already understood that.
That there were principles. And this is the thing with principles.
I think only the Essenes followed every jot and tittle.
Either the Sadducees or Pharisees did too, and the others did not. But this is the thing, whenever you're looking at something as a principle, which in many ways we do too, like even if you look at the 10 Commandments, in a way it's a principles, right? There's interpretation. And interpretation is a little bit of a free-for-all sometimes, and that's why these discussions are so important. Because, yes, let's discuss it. So many times we hear things, we believe things, we never process it.
Yeah.
Like what we were talking about, the fault in the law, but isn't God faultless? How could he create something full of flaws? These are things that we think about, but people don't discuss it because they're worried that it's threatening their faith.
Yeah, it's too closely tied to their salvation.
Yes.
So you mentioned that verse about which one is the greatest commandment, and in Galatians, Paul, I believe, wrote Galatians.
Mm-hmm.
He said in 5:14, it says, "For the whole law can be summed up in a single commandment, namely, you must love your neighbor as yourself." Okay, and he said, and he's quoting Jesus there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and other Old Testament stuff, but mainly Jesus there. And what else Jesus say? Love the Lord. Which one's the greatest? Love the Lord thy God with all your, and love your neighbor as yourself, right? And Paul references the neighbor part, and he says, "However, if you continually bite and devour one another, beware that you are not consumed by one another."
Right.
So he said, the law can be summed up in love thy neighbor as yourself and love the Lord thy God. That may be the greatest commandment of the law.
Of the law.
But it's not good enough.
See, Jesus,
for the new covenant.
Jesus was asked a question, what is the greatest of the law? And Jesus answered that. Until today, we hear people quote that. These same people don't even believe that the law exists today because we live in a time under the new covenant with the time of grace, yet they're always going back to that. It's not that, I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. It leads into the new covenant. It leads into what Jesus was trying to say. Now think about all the passages throughout the Sermon on the Mount, throughout the Bible. Paul talks about righteousness a lot, right? There's all this talk about righteousness. And let's go back to the conversation we had a few weeks ago about righteousness. Being in right standing with God and others. Yeah. Is that not the greatest two commandments? Love the Lord your God and love others. Everything points to love, and it points to God and to others. That is being in right standing.
Yeah.
We're going to see in the Sermon on the Mount multiple times where it talks about righteousness. Seek God and righteousness.
Yeah.
And there's a way that Paul looks at righteousness, which we'll talk about when we get there, and then the way Matthew's framing it. But when you look at that, it's how Jesus summarized the two greatest commandments, and then what Paul said there in Galatians, and there's other places like that. And then the new covenant that was left by Jesus when he was with the disciples in John 13, he said, "I will leave you a new commandment, love one another as you have, as I have loved you." It all sums up to love, which in God's eyes, that is righteousness. And a lot of people don't see that as righteousness. Yeah. That, in essence, is righteousness. To love as he loves. To love God, to love yourself, and to love others as he loves.
Yeah.
It's that simple.
Yeah,
not
so we're
easy,
not actually,
simple.
To your point, we're not obeying the Ten Commandments or the law anymore. Mm-hmm. Of any form.
Right.
Is my argument. Some people say, yeah, we still follow the Ten Commandments. We still follow the moral laws. No, we're actually not.
Right.
We're following the new law of love. We don't steal because of love. We don't kill because of love. We want to worship God because of love. It's all following that new law.
Right.
And the new law, the only commandment that we see in the New Testament that Jesus gave was to love one another.
Right.
And we see many different versions of it, but that's what he did. And Paul tries to take those simple commandments and he tries to show what that looks like not stealing, not killing, not raping, not being lewd and lascivious and all that kind of stuff. He lays a lot of that stuff out. But back to 17 for a moment. So what is he talking about that rule? The first thing you have to understand here is none of this is written to you. So don't read it that way.
Right.
It wasn't written to Andrea and it wasn't written to me.
And I think that's a key thing to remember here.
Remember, they are Jews.
Right.
Currently. They are under the law currently. And the new covenant, Jesus has not died yet.
Right.
So the author is aware of Jesus dying, but he's the only one. The people don't understand that yet. So we have to take that into consideration. So Jesus at that point would have never have abolished anything until he says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away. So now that comes to that heaven and earth, right? So I've not come to abolish those things.
Mm-hmm.
He wouldn't do that because he has not created the new covenant.
Mm-hmm.
So what does he mean by until heaven and earth pass away? What do you think is going on there?
Well, and that's one thing I was going to ask you. Now, I heard on the Bible Project they had a different view of this, but I also know heaven and earth was an idiom. It stood for something. So,
what is your thoughts on it?
Well, I know heaven and earth was an idiom that basically represented a place where God and humans meet,
mm-hmm.
right? Like a meeting place.
Yeah.
The Bible Project sees this the way, like their twist on it, and I'll put it in the show notes so you can go listen to their take on it. But basically, during that time, there was a common practice where when you are talking about something, you would essentially create an image to explain something. So the people saw heaven and earth as eternal. Like, this is never going away. So it was a way to compare, like, just as eternal God is, heaven and earth is. So if heaven and earth isn't going to pass away, then nothing God says is going to pass away.
Yeah, okay, I get that. So God said it, God said it.
So it's another way to look at it, but I want you to explain the heaven and earth piece because a lot of people don't know that.
I can understand what they're saying there because the intentionality behind the covenant was relationship. Mm-hmm. And so until heaven and earth isn't going to pass away, and the relationship isn't going to pass away then. So the intentionality behind the law and the heart of God, that's not changing,
right,
under any circumstances. And nothing is going to change there. So I can understand that point of view. I have a different point of view on that. So I think about the readers, okay? I think about the listeners, the people sitting there that were listening to Jesus speak.
The listeners, not the readers, because they were not reading this.
Right, but I think about the listeners. We talk about reader relevance, but that would be me. Mm-hmm. But it's really the listener relevance. So the people sitting there listening, and what they understood when you said heaven and earth together, there was a lot of idioms, and I agree with the Bible Project on that. But I think to a certain degree, heaven and earth was clearly what they called the top part of the temple heaven and the lower part of the temple earth. Right. And the heaven and earth, the temple was the meeting place of heaven and earth. Yeah. And that Jesus points out in Matthew that heaven and earth is going to be torn down. He points to the temple and says, that's going to be gone. Right. Not one stone will be left upon another. Yeah. So that heaven and earth was the temple being torn down. And the temple was still up. And it stayed up until 70 AD, long after the scripture was written, or with a few years after the last scripture was written. I think the last thing that was written was like around 68, they say. 65, there's some argument about that. So to me, when I read this, I tell you the truth until the temple's gone. Right. Until your system is torn down, not even the smallest letter or stroke of the letter will pass from the law. Which, let me just say this, Bible Project mentioned this, and I thought it was just a cool little detail. And then it said, hold on, it says, until everything takes place. Right. So even the smallest until it, see, and this is, I think, what clicked for me. It's until its purpose is achieved. So basically the law existed, and there was that time after Jesus's death where it continued because there was still something about it where the purpose needed to come forth. Once the purpose of the law served its purpose, right? Mm-hmm. Once it was accomplished, then it came down. And it was completed. I don't like the purpose because it seems to point to something that it's serving a purpose for when it was clearly obsolete. I like the NET's version better because it says, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of the letter will pass from the law until everything takes place. So in other words, there needed to be events that were going to take place. One, the biggest one, which is the creation of the new covenant. Jesus dying. Mm-hmm. Shed his blood, a new covenant was created
Mm-hmm.
at that point. He died to create the new covenant. He didn't die for a lot of things we say we died for.
Right.
He died, though, to create a new covenant, and that had not happened.
Mm-hmm.
And so that needed to happen first. And then
Because he needed to shed his blood.
God showed mercy. To me, he showed mercy on the Jewish people. He allowed the temple to remain for a while,
Mm-hmm.
and he gave them time. Jesus told them in Matthew, he said, it'll be until the end of, he said, this generation will not pass until this happens. Now, a generation at that time was 40 years.
Right.
And the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, almost exactly 40 years. So he gave them the full generation. He could have destroyed it at any moment.
Yes.
But he gave them all the way to the end. And that point is when Rome came in and sacked the temple. And destroyed it and tore it apart.
So it was literal. So here in verse 18, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear. So until the temple is gone, until the temple goes away, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until its purpose is achieved.
Yes.
Until all these things have happened.
Have to point out one of the most common ways to view this, and this is a huge mistake made in the evangelical world in this country, and about 80-90% of the churches in this country have this wrong, and they actually think our current earth and our current heaven is going to be destroyed,
right,
and is going to pass away. And when you read it from that point of view,
yes,
you're going to get way off.
So basically, I'll just throw this out there for anyone who wants to dive in. Matthew 24 is a prophecy, an accurate prophecy that Jesus made that has already happened, and it happened in 70 AD. So go dive in. Maybe one day we'll talk about that. It's just it's not my cup of tea.
But it's important here.
Yeah, but you can go, I may link a person for you to connect with if that's something that floats your boat. But going back to the Message translation, see here what they see how limiting it is. Says God's law is more real than the stars in the sky and the ground at your feet. Long after stars burn out and earth wears out, God's law will be alive and working. So do you see how, like, when you're looking at context and what the readers were understanding and the words that were being used, this does not convey what Jesus was actually saying?
It kind of takes the Bible Project's point of view a little bit, because it's saying, let me try to explain it in
it's trying to
terms.
Say what he said, yes, but there's no end. Like here in the conventional, you see how it comes to an end until Jesus says, not even the smallest detail of God's law will disappear until, and I think yours says that too, until.
Yeah, it says this, tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of the letter will pass from the law until everything takes place.
Until everything takes place. That's the until I'm talking about.
Yeah.
This doesn't have that until. It just has, it's just talking about the eternal aspect.
Yeah, just so again, you're trying to people are sitting here in America in 2024, almost 25, and we're reading that scripture as if it's being written to us.
Yes.
Removing all context,
right,
all idioms, all original authoritarian context, all listener relevance, I should call it. Reader relevance is gone, and that's just not how it works.
Right.
It's just not how scripture is done. That's not.
Yeah, we have to think about what was. So the author here is Matthew. It's not even about what Matthew was trying to say. It's about what Jesus was saying.
Yeah.
And when the people who are listening to him, what were they hearing?
And then in 5:19 it says, so anyone who breaks one of these, or breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever breaks them and teaches others to do so will be called, whoever obeys them and teaches others to do so will be called great in the kingdom of heaven.
Do you see how I had a conflict?
Yeah.
When you don't understand, it's easy to be like, wait, so we are supposed to follow the law?
Yeah, because what Jesus is pointing out to is there is a law of love. There is an intentionality and a purpose for God's people. And we were born with a purpose. God's people were born with a purpose. Even Gentiles were born with a purpose, and that is to love one another. And they had a purpose and the Jewish people in particular, they had a purpose. They were a called out people to be an ambassador of God's love and relationship with God in the earth. Even under the law, they were called to do that. And that was the intentionality, and the law was given to help keep them in some sort of a relationship, even if it wasn't a very good one.
Right.
Okay, it was better than nothing.
Yep.
And so Jesus is saying, listen, the law is still in effect, okay? And you're still supposed to obey these things.
Right.
And keep the commandments. I'm not here to abolish it, okay? Not yet. Until things take place, this is going to continue. And what I'm trying to do is teach you the heart behind it.
Right.
Over and over and over again, Jesus tried to teach them the heart behind it. It says, and then he kind of alludes to what he's talking about. So first he makes this big statement in 19. It says, so anyone who breaks one of the least of these commands and teaches others to do so will be called least in the kingdom of heaven, but whoever obeys them and teaches others to do so will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. And then he kind of clarifies what he's talking about in 20. He says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness goes beyond that of the experts in the law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So he's saying, what is he saying, right? First he says, if you disobey him, you're in trouble. And I'm going to award everyone who does obey him. And then he says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness goes beyond that of the experts in the law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So this is why you don't isolate verses, because he just got done with, blessed are the pure in heart, blessed are the peacemakers. He's telling us how he wants us to live our lives.
Yes, and so this is the thing. During that time, we have to realize that this crowd was filled with people. And the Pharisees and Sadducees were following him around.
Oh, a lot of them were Pharisees and Sadducees, majority of them.
So in this passage, Jesus first sets their minds at ease. Don't worry, guys. I've not come to abolish the law. I've come to fulfill it. As a matter of fact, if you don't obey it and tell people not to, you're going to be least in the kingdom. And he's almost like, hey, guys, I'm on your side. I know the law is very important. And then he takes them down, right? Like thinking about wrestling. He takes them down and he goes, but if you all aren't better at this than the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the experts in the law, the scribes, then you're never going to make it into heaven. Like you literally have to be better than these people. And at the time, again.
And he uses that word righteousness again.
Yes.
Right standing with God. So unless your standing with God is better, your relationship with God
is better than theirs.
Another way to look at it is right relationship with God.
Right.
Right? Unless you're standing with God, your relationship with God is better.
Right.
You're in trouble.
Now think about this, because the people at the time, to them, the Pharisees and the Sadducees were the standard. They were like, they were the higher echelon. Like, these are the people who follow God's laws. Like, these people are the holy people. They're the ones who, they live their lives for God. They know what's going on. And Jesus is saying, no, y'all need to be better than them.
And the Pharisees were known for being a little more accurate.
Yes.
On that kind of
but
stuff.
Jesus is like, what
like
they're
doing. They would forego their fame.
Yes.
Sadducees would not, but Pharisees would forego their fame and fortune to follow the law.
Yeah, Sadducees were very pretentious, blah, blah, blah.
Yeah.
But Jesus is basically saying they're not quite doing it. Like, even what they're doing doesn't measure up.
Yeah.
And again, to your point.
He also is a knock on his own people.
Yes.
Because Jesus came from the Pharisaical group.
Yes.
So it's kind of a knock on his own people.
Well,
He's like saying, hey,
yeah.
at least you're better than even my family. You're out of it.
Yeah, and he says that multiple, it's all about faith and the heart's intention. It's not about family. But again, to your point before, is we can't read the Sermon on the Mount, in my opinion. Obviously, we're breaking it up for the purposes of this podcast because we don't have, people are not going to listen to us if we have a 24-hour podcast. But you can't read the Sermon on the Mount and truly understand the essence of what Jesus was saying if you break it up, right? So we see the Beatitudes. Jesus is setting the stage. I am here for these people. The kingdom of God is with these people. Basically, in essence, these are the types of people who will inherit the kingdom, are in the kingdom. I am with them.
Yes.
They will be comforted. And then he basically assures them of their identity. You are the salt. You are the light. You are here to be a beacon of light, to draw people to God, to bring light into the darkness. And now he's coming into this place where he's like, well, let me just assure you, I'm not here to break the law. I'm here to fulfill the law. I'm here to show you what it looks like. Until everything takes place, the law continues. So don't tell people to break the law, because that's not what I'm about. And your righteousness is going to have to exceed. And now he's going to get into, well, what does that look like? And that's going to be what we're going to get into in the next episode. Jesus is going to talk about different topics.
Yeah.
And in essence, right, when you look at it, the core is it's about the heart.
Yeah, and I think
it's about your intention.
I think that's a mistake that's made in the evangelical world, because if you read beyond what we just read today, he kind of lays it out pretty clear, right? And if you read before what he read today, what he said today, he makes it very clear. But
Right.
People today, they want to make a message out of a specific verse.
Right.
And they take it out of context, and they put their own spin on it, and they create weird end times theology out of the heaven and earth thing.
Yep.
They create a weird legalism thing out of the law statement.
Yep.
And they make it, and they create a theology that was never intended, and totally out of context.
And that's what Jesus was essentially saying when he came and he gave us the new covenant, which is to love as he loves. It's every commandment that God had given to them through the law of Moses can be summarized in love as he loves, like period. Everything falls under there. But what happened? Humans got so caught up in the rules and they missed the principle. They missed the point. They tried to be self-righteous. They tried to make something holy that's not what it is. That's not what this is about.
Yeah.
So for example, to finish off, let's talk about, for example, Sabbath, I think is something that is a good example. There are people today who celebrate Sabbath, and in some ways, humans tend to do Sabbath, right? Like you at least have a day where you need to rest. It is ingrained in human nature. You just understand and recognize that you need to take a day of rest, right?
Yeah.
And there are people who will follow, they have like Judeo-Christian principles, and then you have Christians who kind of go into the Jewish roots, and that's cool. Like I'm not against it. I think it's pretty cool. Yeah, I think that's pretty cool because it's where Christianity came from. You can't dismiss Jewish culture because it's where we came from and Jesus came from that culture. I think it's beautiful to understand. But then they incorporate these aspects of the law. And this is where I think this passage, sometimes people can use it to justify. So they'll go and do Sabbath, and Sabbath had certain rules. It was from this time to this time, this day to this day. And you couldn't walk so many steps, and you couldn't cook, and you couldn't do all these things. And the heart of what the Sabbath was for was to worship God and delight in what you have created.
Yeah.
Delight in your work.
Yeah.
So when you look at technically, when God rested from creation, you know, God didn't do manual labor. Like, God didn't have manual. What was God tired of? Speaking? You know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
when you really look at the principles of the day of rest that God had, he was delighting in his creation. He was looking at it. He had said everything was good. And, now it's time to go live in it. Like, we've worked so hard. Let's go live. Like, let's go be. And Sabbath is the same intention. Sabbath is supposed to be for us to live what we worked so hard. You work so hard.
Yeah.
Now go enjoy the thing. And it's hard for people to wrap their minds around, especially if you're in corporate world, right? So you're in corporate world, you're building and constructing for other people. You're not out farming, you're not picking the land, you're not harvesting, so people have a hard time thinking about that. But the reality is, whether you have a corporate job or you have a farm, whatever you have done has brought finances into your home that allows you to eat, that allows you to entertain, that allows you to have the comforts of that the earth has to offer. You're supposed to delight in those things. Take a day to enjoy life. Why are you going to work? But today, with some of these different groups, they've embraced Sabbath. Again, I'm not opposed. If you want to celebrate it from Friday to Saturday, that's fine. But they're imposing these new rules. Like you must have this amount of candles. You must have this at your meal. And it's going back to guys, the purpose is to enjoy, is to spend time with family, it's to worship me. It is not to have a certain amount of candles, a certain type of food. It's not about what time it is. It's just take a day out of the week to do these things, because some people's Sabbath cannot be that day they work, but they can do it on Sunday, or they can do it on Wednesday. Right? Yeah, so it's about the principle. It's about looking and saying,
I like to take 2 days.
Oh, me too.
I'm a 2-day Sabbath guy. But we got to remember, coming out of, remember when the Sabbath came about, right? Mm-hmm. Remember they were going from bondage,
right,
to some sort of agreement with God, not the one he wanted. But God needed them to have a rule, otherwise they would not. They were such a bondage-minded people, and they would work. They worked 12 hours a day, 7 days a week, and they had no time off. And
did
that's
they have
how they
7
lived.
Days a week back then?
Yes, they did. And they worked every day in Egypt, and they never stopped. Right? So
I'm so funny.
And every single day they did that.
Right.
And they never had any time off. And then God puts right in the rules that you have to take at least one day off. It was a gift.
Right. It was
to
for
point
the people.
To the people. Every time he gave a law, it was to point to God's heart.
Right.
Every law points to love.
Right.
Points to God wanting to have a relationship. Whether it's murder, thou shalt not kill. This is proving again, I'm a God that doesn't kill.
Do not commit adultery. Do not steal.
Sabbath was, I'm not a God that's going to make you work every day.
Right.
I want you to enjoy life.
I give you rest.
I give you rest. I had rest. I want you to give rest.
Right.
Right. And technically, I mean, you could go all the way back to, like you said, in Genesis, right? God rested.
Right.
God enjoyed his creation.
Sabbath,
he wanted us to do the same.
Sabbath is for us. We are not for Sabbath. And it's the same thing with earth. Like, you have people who are environmentally conscious, which I'm totally fine with, because to some degree I do care. I'm not going to say to some degree. I do care, period. But we have to realize that earth was created for humans, not humans for the earth.
Right.
Yes, humans, in the story of creation, humans are last. But that's because God was creating something for the humans, and he wanted it to be done before the humans were created. So the earth is there for us, not us for them. So for you to save the planet instead of humanity and think humanity needs to cease in order to save earth, that's so anti-God.
It's the opposite, yeah.
It's the opposite. So just
You actually preserve the earth in order to help preserve humanity.
yes,
That's the whole point of
right.
having clean water, clean air,
It's
is to help humanity.
yes, it was God created it for us. We are to reign, subdue this land, and we don't always do a good job of it, and we dismiss certain things oftentimes because we don't think about the generations to come. But it's not about the world's going to explode, no, it's about we have generations to come. They will live on this earth. What can we do to...
Maybe. If you read it from the heaven and earth pass away thing, then you don't care about environment at all.
Exactly. Because you think it's all going to blow up.
It's all going to burn anyways.
It's not. I mean, it's funny because he shall remain nameless, but there was a commercial that I was listening to, and he talked about how, everyone always thinks that the earth is going to go away, but really the future that we read about in Revelation is here on earth. And he takes the doom and gloom out, but still has the same end times belief. So it's kind of funny, but I was like, well, at least he recognizes that earth isn't going to explode into a big ball of fire and go
Right.
away. Like, we will be here. That's a discussion for another day. But hopefully this has brought some sort of clarity as to why we don't. I think the last thing that what I would like is for you to explain is the whole contract thing, because you had to use contract as an example and that clicked with me. And I don't know if it's because of what I do for a living, but yes, because I have a full-time job. This is just for fun. So explain it from abolish, fulfill, the fulfillment part from a contract perspective.
Yeah. So, well, that's a good one. So I think I understand what you're saying. So he didn't come to... The law was not over yet. It was still in operation. It was still going. So the agreement, the contract, was still in operation, still going. And the fulfillment of it ends it. Okay? So until it's done, the agreement doesn't end.
Right.
Okay? It says, I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth pass away, not the smallest letter or stroke of the letter will pass from the law until everything takes place. So as long as that agreement was ongoing until Jesus died and created the new covenant, and the temple was still there, there was still a certain level of validity there. And so they had to continue with it. And once that ends, I think what you're asking about specifically, though, is fulfilling.
What does it mean to fulfill? Like, he didn't come to abolish,
right.
fulfill. What
so
does
the
that
first
mean?
step in fulfilling it was creating a new one, which is the law points. The whole point of the law was to point to us bringing in relationship.
I think from the perspective of the contract, right? It was, think about, because I work with contracts, so this made a lot of sense to me. You have a contract has an end date. It's signed by everyone. It existed. It's real.
Yeah.
But once the end date of that contract happens, it ceases to exist.
Yeah, it ceases to exist. It's fulfilled
Not that
at
it
that
never
point.
existed.
No.
Not that you've abolished it. It's just fulfilled.
It's done.
The contract is completed. It's no longer valid. It serves no use.
Yeah, and it
you
actually
cannot use it anymore.
A contract can be obsolete in the new, and that's why I brought up that verse earlier, because it's fading away. It's obsolete.
Right.
So this contract, although still in agreement, still there, it's obsolete. It's no longer relevant.
Well, and it's like,
and by the time Paul came along, it was obsolete because Jesus had died. He had made a new covenant.
right.
The
But
temple,
Jesus-
the heaven and earth hadn't passed away
Right.
yet.
So that's why he said it's fading away.
Fading away.
So it's almost like the expiration date is coming.
Yep.
It's on the tail end. it's still there.
And the apostles and Paul argued about this to no end.
Right.
Paul was saying, cut out all that garbage.
Right.
You know, you don't need to follow it anymore. And the apostles, some of them argued for following it because of Jesus' teaching here.
And the reality
Heaven and earth
is,
wasn't gone. The temple wasn't gone. But Paul's point was it's going to be.
Right.
This
so
is all going to end.
in John 13, Jesus is with the disciples. They're not yet apostles. They're disciples. They are students. Apostles become leaders. They are leaders. So Jesus is with the disciples. He, at the Last Supper, he basically has what I call a crash course in leadership. Like, these are the things as leaders I want you to know. And this is where he institutes the new covenant. I leave you. He's telling the disciples, okay, he's talking to the disciples and he says, I leave you a new commandment. Love as I have loved.
Yeah.
This is how you will be known as my disciples.
By your love
for one another.
Yeah.
So Jesus institutes this. He tells them the reality is if you do this, you're still following the law.
Yeah.
Right. So when they're in that in between, it's fading away. It's still there, but not really there. Even after Jesus ascended into heaven, if there was any like, I don't know. Well, Jesus said, this is the new commandment.
Yeah.
This is how you're going to be known
and
as my
disciples. And they're
disciples.
following it because it's coming out of them now.
Right.
It's coming out of their heart. It's a desire of their heart instead of a rule that they follow.
Right.
And Paul was constantly arguing, saying, listen, this needs to be a desire of your heart. You need to be transformed. You need to be made new. You need to have a renewing of mind. And some of the apostles were arguing against him, saying, no, we still need to do all these traditional stuff. And Paul was like, fine, you can do it, but you might as well cut it all off.
Right.
When he talked about circumcision, he said, you might as well cut the whole thing off instead of just cutting off a little bit, which is crazy and obviously a joke. But his point was it needs to come from the heart.
Paul didn't make jokes. He was holy.
Well, they all made jokes. If you read through Scripture,
no one was sarcastic in the Bible, and nobody was funny.
What about when Jesus called them?
They were all very
serpents
serious.
And
well, he was Jesus. He could say whatever he wants. Michael
said their father was the devil.
Yeah, it's pretty intense.
Was their father actually the devil?
No.
Therefore, it was
sarcasm. Or there's another word for it. You was being facetious. Is that the word you like to use? But what you just said, going into the next section, that's exactly the point that Jesus is going to make. He's going to talk about murder. He's going to talk about adultery. He's going to talk about all these things.
Yeah.
And he's going to talk about loving your enemy. And he's going to teach on what love really is. Because again, according to the law and the prophets, it was love your neighbor as yourself.
Yes. And I want to say something too, real quickly, because back to contracting. Once a contract is fulfilled, once the obligation of the contract is fulfilled, it ends. It's over.
You
and
can't
the
use
law,
it's not valid.
It's not valid. It has no value. And today, both the temple is destroyed and the new covenant has been created. Okay, for a very long time now, several thousand years. Okay, a couple thousand years at least.
Since 70 AD.
So
sometime.
the law, people read this and they say, see, the law is not abolished and it'll never be abolished because heaven and earth still exists.
Yes.
That's a stupid thing to say, and I'll tell you why. That's a
Michael, that's a harsh word. We're going to learn that not to call people idiots.
I'm going to rephrase so you can cut that out. That is a very, very large misunderstanding, okay, for a very small-minded person. And the reason is, the only reason you could get to there is if you don't understand heaven and earth, and you don't realize that when a contract ends, it's over.
Right.
At that point, it's done. He doesn't have to abolish anything.
Right, because it's fulfilled.
It ends itself.
Yes.
It passes away.
Yes.
Paul talks about that. It passes away. It's over.
He didn't come to destroy it. He didn't come to undo it. He came to fulfill it. It will reach its expiration date. Yeah. Jesus came to make sure that happened. And it didn't just expire. Jesus came so that there could be something new and something unending. So the new covenant will never end.
Yes, and the relationship that God desired, even with those under the law, never changed.
Right.
God's heart for God's people never changed. He wanted that relationship. He wanted to walk in relationship with them. That never changed.
Right.
And so that's why he's saying what God wants for his people is way beyond the law.
Right.
The law is not even relevant.
Right. The reality is we look at this, right, and there's this elusive 600 something laws and it's so hard to follow. Mind you, Jesus is saying, basically, when you read this, you see, you know what? The law was possible to follow because there were people who didn't. God considered people righteous.
In Scripture,
right?
He pointed out a couple of people that
people
were
see
able
this
to do
law
it.
as like this elusive thing and like, oh my gosh, it was so difficult to follow the law. And what Jesus is about to introduce is like a whole other level. And I used to use the term like he ups the ante. I no longer see it as him upping the ante. I see it as he's revealing what it was always about.
Yes, that is the key right there. He's revealing the grant covenants that he's always wanted to have for his people.
So that is what we're about to go into. We're going to explore, we're going to start digging and discovering the treasure of what in the world that means. What was the true intention of the law? What was it about? And in the NLT, it uses the word purpose. What was the purpose God had for the law? Like there was a purpose for it. What was it? We're going to talk about that in the next several episodes.
That's right.
All right, guys, until next time, enjoy. And don't forget to read the Sermon on the Mount at least once this week. And if you don't like to read, no worries. Head over to my YouTube channel and look up the audio version of the Sermon on the Mount. Pop it in 13 minutes, I think. You will have listened to it. Bye, guys.
Bye.